Welcome to a world of stories. Please kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel to get more of our newly added videos and don't forget to hit the notification bell. Today I will cheer up your day with this beautiful story, titled Two Princesses. Once upon a time there lived a Raja king, who was left with two little daughters, the two princesses, when his wife died. Not very long after his first wife died, he married again. His second wife did not care for her stepchildren and was often unkind to them. The Raja, their father, never troubled himself to look after them, but allowed his wife to treat them as she liked. This made the poor girls very unhappy, and one day one of them said to the other, "Let's not stay here anymore. Come away into the jungle, for nobody here cares whether we go or stay." So they both walked off into the jungle and lived for many days on jungle fruits. After they had wandered on for a long while, they came to a fine palace which belonged to an ogre, but both the ogre and his wife were out when they got there. One of the princesses said to the other, "This fine palace, in the middle of the jungle, can belong to no one but the horrible ogre that has hurt our people for so long. But no one is at home now. Let's go in and see if we can find anything to eat. I am so tired of jungle fruit." So they went into the ogre's house and found some rice. One princess kept watch out of the window while the other boiled the dinner. They hadn't even finished their meal and put the dishes to the sink when the ogre and his wife returned home. The two princesses were so frightened that they ran up to the top of the house and hid themselves on the flat roof, where they could look down onto the inner courtyard of the house, and from the other could see the open country. But the rooftop was a favorite spot of the ogre and his wife. Here they would sit on the hot summer evenings or hang their clothes to dry in the open sun. The two princesses had to hide. They found shelter behind some stalks of corn, but that would not hide them for long. When the ogre came into the house, he looked around and said to his wife, "Somebody has been moving the furniture, everything looks different." "Wife, did you do this?" "No," she said. "I don't know who could have done all this." "Someone also has been cooking the rice," continued the ogre. "Wife, did you cook the rice?" "No," she answered. "I did not do it. I don't know who did." Then the ogre walked around and around several times with his nose up in the air, saying, "Someone is here now. I smell human flesh and blood. Where can they be?" "Stuff and nonsense," said the wife. "You smell flesh and blood, indeed. Why, with all the humans you killed only this morning, I should wonder if you didn't still smell flesh and blood." They went on quarreling this way until the ogre said, "Well, never mind. I don't know how it is, but I'm very thirsty. Let's go outside and drink some water." So both the ogre and his wife went to a well close to the house, and began letting down jars into it, and drawing up the water, and drinking it. And the princesses, who were on the top of the house, saw them. Now the younger of the two princesses was a very clever girl, and when she saw the ogre and his wife by the well, she said to her sister, "I will do something now that will be good for us and good for everyone." Running down quickly from the top of the house, she crept close behind the ogre and his wife as they stood on tiptoe over the side of the well. The girl grabbed hold of one of the ogre's heels with one hand and one of his wife's heels with her other hand, gave each a mighty push, and knocked the ogres down into the well. They both were drowned. The princess then returned to her sister and said, "I killed the ogres." "What? Both of them?" cried her sister. "Yes, both," she said. "Won't they come back?" said her sister. "Never," she said. So the two princesses lived happily in the ogre's house for a long time. In it they found rich clothes and jewels, gold and silver, which the ogres had taken from people they had killed. Every morning the youngest princess would tend to the flocks of chickens and herds of cows, taking them off to pasture, while the older one stayed at home, cooked the dinner, and kept the house. The younger princess, who was the wise one, would often say to her sister in the morning, Take care that if you see any stranger, be it a man, woman, or child, come by the house, to hide so that nobody may know that we live here. If anyone should call out and ask for a drink of water, or any poor beggar ask for food, before you give it to them be sure you put on ragged clothes and cover your face with charcoal and make yourself as ugly looking as possible. Otherwise, seeing how fair you are, they might steal you away and we would never meet again. Very well, her older sister would answer, I will do as you say. But a long time passed, and no one ever came by that way. At last one day, after the younger princess had gone out, an old Rani queen, the wife of a neighboring Raja, who had been traveling for many days with her attendants, came near the place when searching for water, for she and her people had been seeking all through the jungle for a stream, but could find none. When the Rani saw the fine palace, standing all by itself in the middle of the jungle, she was very much astonished and said, It is a strange thing that anyone should have built such a house as this in the depths of the forest. Let us go in, the owners will doubtless give us a drink of water. No, no, do not go, cried her attendants. This is most assuredly the house of an ogre. I should scarcely think anything very terrible lives here, for there is not a sound stirring, nor a living creature to be seen. So she began tapping at the door, which was bolted, and called, Will whoever owns this house give me and my people some water to drink? But nobody answered, for the princess, who heard her coming, was busy up in her room, blacking her face with charcoal and covering her rich dress with rags. Then the Rani got impatient and shook the door, saying angrily, Let me in, whoever you are. If you don't, I'll force the door open. At this the poor little princess got dreadfully frightened, and having blacked her face and made herself look as ugly as possible, she ran downstairs with a pitcher of water. Unbolting the door, she gave the Rani the pitcher to drink from, but the maiden did not speak, for she was afraid. Now the Rani was a very clever woman, and as she raised the pitcher to her mouth to drink the water, she thought to herself, This is a very strange-looking creature who has brought me this jug of water. She would be pretty, but that her face seems to need washing, and her dress also is very untidy. What can that black stuff be on her face and hands? It looks very unnatural. And so instead of drinking the water, she threw it in the princess' face. The princess started back with a little cry while the water, trickling down her face, washed off the charcoal and showed her delicate features and beautiful complexion. The Rani caught hold of her hand and said, Now tell me true, who are you? Where do you come from? Who are your father and mother? And why are you here alone by yourself in the jungle? Answer me, or I'll have your head cut off. And she summoned one of her guards, who drew his sword. The princess was so terrified she could hardly speak, but as best she could, she told how she was the daughter of a king, and had run away into the jungle because of her cruel stepmother, and finding the house had lived there ever since, and, having finished her story, she began to cry. Then the Rani said to her, Pretty child, forgive me for my roughness, do not fear, I will take you home with me. As the daughter of a Raja you shall be a proper wife for my son. But the more she spoke to the princess the more frightened the princess became, and could do nothing but cry. Now the girl had said nothing to the queen about her sister, nor even told her that she had one, for she thought, This Rani says she will kill me. If she hears that I have a sister, they may kill her too. At last the Rani said to one of her servants, Place this young lady in one of the palanquins and we will set off for home. And so they did. When the princess found herself shut up in the palanquin and being carried she knew not where, she thought how terrible it would be for her sister to return home and find her gone, and determined, if possible, to leave some sign to show her which way she had been taken. Round her neck were many strings of pearls. She untied them, and tearing her sari robe into little bits, tied one pearl in each piece of the sari, that it might be heavy enough to fall straight to the ground. And so she went on, dropping one pearl and then another, all the way she went along, until they reached the palace where the queen lived. She threw the last remaining pearl down just as they reached the palace gate. The Rani commanded her son to appear. When he did, she said, "My son, you have tarried long enough in choosing a bride. I told you that if you did not choose one for yourself I would find one for you, and so I have. Here she is." And she thrust the girl forward. She was still weeping and the prince could tell that she was hardly a willing bride. When they were alone, he whispered, "Fear not, maiden. I will postpone the wedding for as long as I can. And if the wedding must take place, you will not be forced to say or do anything you do not want to do." But she barely heard him, thinking only of her sister, and too distraught and fearful to say or do anything else. Meanwhile the younger princess, who had been out with her flocks when the queen took her sister away, had returned home. When she came back she found the door wide open and no one standing there. She thought it very odd, for her sister always came every night to the door to meet her on her return. She went upstairs. Her sister was not there, the whole house was empty and deserted. There she must stay all alone, for the evening had closed in and it was impossible to go outside and seek her with any hope of success. So all night long she waited, crying, "Someone has been here, and they have stolen her away, they have stolen my darling away. Oh, sister, my sister." Next morning, very early, going out to continue the search, she found one of the pearls belonging to her sister's necklace tied up in a small piece of sari. A little further on lay another, and yet another, all along the road the Rani had gone. Then the princess understood that her sister had left this clue to guide her on her way, and she at once set off to find her. Very, very far she went, a 2 months' journey through the jungle, for she could not travel fast, the many days walking tired her so much, and sometimes it took her 2 or 3 days just to find the next piece of sari with the pearl. At last she came near a large town, to which it was evident her sister had been taken. Now this young princess was very beautiful indeed, as beautiful as she was wise, and when she got near the town she thought to herself, "If people see me they may steal me away as they did my sister. And then I shall never find her again. I will disguise myself." As she was thus thinking, she noticed by the side of the road a skeleton and a shriveled, dry fur of an old tiger. The princess took the skin and washed it, and drew it on over her own lovely face and neck, as one draws a glove on one's hand. The skin was so old nothing remained of the shape of the tiger, and only a yellowish hue, and it hung on her the way an old woman's skin might hang. Then she took a long stick and began hobbling along, leaning on it, toward the town. On she went, picking up the pearls, one here, one there, until she found the last pearl just in front of the palace gate. Then she felt certain her sister must be somewhere near, but where, she did not know. She longed to go into the palace and ask for her, but no guards would have let such a wretched-looking old woman enter, and she did not dare offer them any of the pearls she had with her, lest they should think she was a thief. So she determined merely to remain as close to the palace as possible, and wait till fortune favored her with the means of learning something further about her sister. Just opposite the palace was a small house belonging to a farmer, and the princess went up to it and stood by the door. The farmer's wife saw her and said, "Poor old woman, who are you? Why are you here? Have you no one in the world?" "Alas, no," answered the princess. "I am a poor old woman and have neither father nor mother, son nor daughter, sister nor brother, to take care of me. All are gone and I can only beg my bread from door to door." "Do not grieve, good mother," answered the farmer's wife, kindly. "You may sleep in the shelter of our porch and I will give you food." So the princess stayed there for that night and for many more, and every day the good farmer's wife gave her food. But all this time she could learn nothing of her sister. Now there was a large tank near the palace on which grew some fine lotus plants covered with rich crimson lotuses, the royal flower, and of these the Rani was very fond indeed, and prized them very much. To this tank, because it was the nearest to the farmer's house, the princess would go every morning, very early, almost before it was light, at about 3 o'clock, and take off the old tiger's skin that helped her to look like an old woman, and wash it, and hang it out to dry, and wash her face and hands and bathe her feet in the cool water, and comb her beautiful hair. Then she would gather a lotus flower, such as she had been accustomed to wear in her hair as a child, and put it on, so as to feel for a few minutes like herself again. Thus she would amuse herself. Afterwards, as soon as the wind had dried the old skin, she put it on again, threw away the lotus flower, and hobbled back to the farmer's door, before the sun was up. After a time the Rani discovered that someone had plucked some of her favorite lotus flowers. People were set to watch, and all the wise men in the kingdom put their heads together to try and discover the thief, but to no avail. At last, the excitement about this matter being very great, the queen's younger son, a brave and noble young prince, said, "I will certainly discover this thief." It chanced that several fine trees grew round the tank. Into one of these the young prince climbed one evening, and there he watched all the night through, but with no more success than his predecessors. The lotus plants lay still in the moonlight, without so much as a thieving wind coming by to break off one of the flowers. The prince began to get very sleepy and thought the thief, whoever he might be, could not intend to return when, in the very early morning, before it was light, who should come down to the tank but an old woman he had often seen near the palace gate. "Ah, ha," thought the prince, "this then is the thief, but what can this queer old woman want with lotus flowers?" Imagine his astonishment when the old woman sat down on the steps of the tank and began pulling the skin off her face and arms. And from underneath the shriveled yellow skin came the loveliest face he had ever beheld. So fair, so fresh, so young, so gloriously beautiful, that appearing thus suddenly it dazzled the prince's eyes like a flash of lightning. "Ah," thought he, "can this be a woman or a spirit? A devil or an angel in disguise?" The princess twisted up her glossy black hair and, plucking a red lotus, placed it in it, and dabbled her feet in the water, and amused herself by putting round her neck a string of the pearls that had been her sister's necklace. Then, as the sun was rising, she threw away the lotus and, covering her face and arms again with the withered skin, went hastily away. When the prince got home the first thing he said to his mother was, "Mother, I should like to marry that old woman who stands all day at the farmer's gate, just opposite." "What?" cried the Rani. "You are mad. Marry that skinny old thing. You cannot. You are a prince. Are there not enough princesses in all the world that you should wish to marry a wretched old beggar woman?" But he answered, "Above all things I should like to marry that old woman. You know that I have ever been a dutiful and obedient son. In this matter, I pray you, grant me my desire." Seeing he was really in earnest about the matter, and that nothing she could say would alter his mind, she agreed, not, however, without telling him in no uncertain terms what a terrible mistake he was making, and sent out the guards, who fetched the old woman, who was really the princess in disguise, to the palace. There she was married to the prince as privately, and with as little ceremony as possible, for the Rani wanted no one to know of the matter. As soon as the wedding was over, the prince said to his wife, "Gentle wife, tell me how much longer you intend to wear that old skin. You had better take it off. Do be so kind." The princess wondered how he knew of her disguise, or whether it was only a guess. She thought, "He seems kind, but if I take off this ugly skin, my husband will think me pretty and perhaps he will shut me up in the palace and never let me go away, and then I shall never be able to find my sister. No, I had better not take it off." So she answered, "I don't know what you mean. Nobody can change their skin. This she mumbled as if she were a very old woman indeed, and had lost all her teeth and could not speak plain. At this the prince laughed very much to himself and thought, I'll wait and see how long this lasts. But the princess continued to keep on the old skin. Only every morning at about 3 o'clock, before it was light, she would get up and wash it and put it on again. Then some time afterwards the prince, having found this out, got up softly one morning early and followed her to the next room, where she had washed the skin and placed it on the floor to dry. Stealing it, he ran away with the skin and threw it on the fire. So the princess, having no old skin to put on, was obliged to appear in her own likeness. As she walked forth, very sad at missing her disguise, her husband ran to meet her, smiling and saying, How do you do, my dear? Where is your skin now? Soon the whole palace had heard the joyful news of the beautiful young wife that the prince had won, and all the people when they saw her, cried, Why, she is exactly like the beautiful princess our young prince married, the jungle lady. The younger prince took her to introduce his bride to his older brother's wife. No sooner did the princess enter her sister-in-law's room, than she saw that in her she had found her lost sister, and they ran into each other's arms. Great then was the joy of all, but the happiest of all these happy people were the two princesses who were at last reunited, and they lived together in peace and joy their whole lives long. I hope you enjoyed the story. Kindly listen to The Little Mermaid story. Far out in the sea where the water is very deep, the Sea King ruled the undersea world. In the deepest spot of the sea was his castle. The walls were made of blue coral. On the roof were shells that opened and closed when the water passed by. And that is where the Sea King lived with his mother and 4 daughters, each one born a year apart. The youngest of the 4 princesses was the Little Mermaid. She spent much of her time swimming to ships that had fallen to the bottom of the sea. The ships held treasures from the world above. She would fill her arms and set up her collection here and there. All the while she would sing. As she did, fish circled around to hear her. For the Little Mermaid's voice was the most beautiful one under the sea. The girls knew that when they turned 15, they could swim up to the surface for the first time. It would be a long time that the Little Mermaid had to wait, as she was the youngest. So she made her grandmother tell her all about life up on land. Tales about ships and towns, and every bit of stories about humans that she knew. Soon the eldest sister turned 15. She was the first to be allowed to rise up to the surface. When she came back, she had many wonders to tell her sisters about. She told about resting on soft white sand. High above was a deep blue sky with puffy white clouds. Later the sun set, she said, and the whole sky turned gold and red. She had watched the birds fly high above her, dipping and making turns in the red and gold sky. When the next sister turned 15, it was winter. She told of icebergs floating in the sea and shining bright. All the ships stayed far away from the icebergs, she said, as if in fear. But the icebergs did not seem lonely. They were like friends, floating close to each other. When it was the third sister's turn, she told about moving as close as she could to the gate of a town. She heard people call out, horses that went clip, clopping down the street. And even music that she had never heard before. All this the Little Mermaid heard with wonder. It wasn't fair that she had to wait the longest. At last the day came when she turned 15, too. Now she could rise up over the surface and see for herself. When she came up over the water, the Little Mermaid was next to a large ship. On the ship beautiful music was playing. Sailors were dancing on the deck. They were laughing and having a fine time. It must be a party. Now and then as the waves lifted up the Little Mermaid, she could see better. A handsome young man stepped out on the deck. When he did, 100 rockets rose in the air. The party was for him. Was it his birthday? She swam closer. The men all seemed to like that young man. When he spoke, The sailors would laugh. Sometimes they patted him on his back in joy. Once that made his crown fall off. The men laughed and picked it up. A crown, said the little mermaid. He must be a prince. Suddenly, it became very dark and the wind picked up. The sailors started to run about on deck. They pulled down the sail. The ship dipped and swooped. It rolled side to side, and up and down on the high waves. Then lightning, thunder, a strong rainstorm hit. The poor ship started to tip on the rough waves. It was so dark that the little mermaid could see nothing. Then lightning lit up the sky, and she could see the young prince on deck. He seemed to be the only one still there. He was working hard to keep the ship afloat. He was throwing ropes out to his men who had jumped. But then, all at once, the waves got very high and the ship started to tip over. The prince was flung to the side of the ship and thrown overboard. Down into the sea he fell. He dropped very fast. What was the little mermaid to do? She knew that human beings cannot live under the water. She dove deep and fast. She reached out and was able to grab his shirt. Then she swam up to the surface as fast as she could. At last she could pull his head above the water. There the two of them floated as the waves rose and fell. By morning, the storm had passed. Yet the prince was as still as he had been all night. From far off the little mermaid saw tops of hills. Land, she said. She swam to the shore, pulling him behind her. It was not easy to pull the young man up onto dry sand, but she did it. Was he dead? She sang a sad song. All of a sudden, the prince started to move. Oh, are you all right? She asked, and touched his forehead. Just then, she heard a group of girls come over. At once, she dove into the sea and hid behind a rock. They must not see her, a mermaid. The girls found the prince, who was now awake. They called for help and soon he was led off. The prince would never know that she had saved him. The little mermaid sank into a deep gloom. When she went back home, her sisters wanted to know all about her trip. But she was too sad to say anything. Days went by. Then weeks. The sisters went to the grandmother for help. The old woman went to her granddaughter. "Child, what is the matter?" she said. The little mermaid cried out, "Grandmother, I will never be happy again." She told about meeting the prince and saving him. Then having to leave him behind. "Unless I can somehow walk on land and be with that young man, I will be sad for the rest of my days." "My dear," said the grandmother, "you know as well as I do that it is not possible for a mermaid to walk on two legs. Why, the only one who can do anything like that is the sea witch. But of course it is much too dangerous to go to her." The sea witch. Before she knew it, the little mermaid was headed to the far corner of the sea, where the sea witch lived. "This is no problem," said the sea witch when the little mermaid told her what she needed. "I fix problems much harder than this. Why, to have legs all you need to do is to drink my potion." Then she turned to face the girl. "But I don't just give it away, you understand." "Oh," said the little mermaid. "What then is your price?" In her heart, she felt a lift. So there was a way she could have two legs and be with the prince after all. "Oh, not too much," said the sea witch. "For one, you must give up your voice." "My voice," said the little mermaid. She knew her voice is what everyone loved about her the best. "You don't need it," said the sea witch. "Chitter, chatter, what a waste of time. But know this, little pretty. If the prince marries someone else, the next day you must die. And your voice will stay with me forever. But then again, who knows? He might choose you." The little mermaid's heart leaped. The sea witch held out a glass with the green potion. "So," she said, "what are you going to do? Make up your mind. I don't have all day." The little mermaid took the potion and drank it. At once she felt dizzy and in pain, as if a sword was being passed through her body. She spun and jerked about, then fell. When she awoke, She was on the same dry land as when she had rescued the prince. Lifting up her head, she could see that her dream had come true. Where her tail had been, she had 2 human legs. Say, miss, are you in trouble? It was none other than the prince. She tried to say something but no words came out of her mouth. Can you not speak? Said he. She shook her head. No. Oh, well then, let me take you to the castle. You can clean up there and get some dry clothes to wear. You can be sure the little mermaid was very happy to join the prince at the castle. At first, walking on her 2 legs was shaky, but soon she got the hang of it. That night, the prince showed her around the castle rooms. He would point to a portrait and tell her all about the person. When he said something funny, they laughed together. When the story was sad, her kind eyes told him that she knew why and she felt sad, too. The next day was a royal party. The prince had not been not looking forward to going to it. Hours of standing with finely dressed people who talk and have nothing to say. He asked the little mermaid if she might come with him. She nodded a big yes. That day, with the little mermaid by his side, the prince felt glad. Sometimes he would make a comment in a low voice to her. And by her eyes and face, he knew that she understood. After that, the prince wanted the little mermaid by his side every day. He thought he could even fall in love with her. But he still held out hope to marry the one with the lovely voice he remembered from when he had been rescued. Of course, it could not be his wonderful new friend who was not able to talk, let alone sing. The king called for his son one day. Son, he said, your mother and I have made a decision. It is time that you took a bride. Lucky for you that we already picked one out for you. What? Said the prince. He only wanted to marry the woman with the beautiful voice that he remembered. Who is she? A princess from a nearby land. Tonight she is coming with her parents. We will make the wedding plans. The prince was crushed. And the little mermaid felt fear. She knew what would happen to her the day after the prince married someone else. That night her troubles got even worse. What the little mermaid did not know was that the sea witch had put her voice into this princess. She was a stuck-up princess who thought only of herself. Yet when she spoke, it was the little mermaid's voice that came out. The prince was stunned. He asked the princess to sing. It was the little mermaid's voice that filled the room. The prince could not believe his luck. At last, he could marry the woman he had longed for all this time. When he shared his joy with the little mermaid, she tried to show that she was happy for him. But gloom filled her heart. The next morning at dawn, the little mermaid went to the sea. Her sisters, worried since they had not heard from her, rose above the water to see how she was. The youngest sister let them know the trouble she was in. The prince's wedding was going to take place the very next day. And the day after that she must die. The sisters said not to worry, that they had an idea. They told her to come back to the shore later that night. Then they dove back into the sea. That night, the little mermaid came back to the shore as she was told to do. The 3 sisters rose up again. Gone was their beautiful long hair. For they had cut it all off to give to the sea witch in exchange for a knife. With the knife, the little mermaid must kill the princess that very night. Then the wedding could not take place and she could return to the sea and be with her family. She took the knife for she knew how much they had done for her in love. But in her heart she knew she was not going to kill the princess. The wedding day had arrived. The little mermaid stepped up to the wedding ship with the other guests. The wedding would take place at sunset. In the meantime, the 3 sisters had returned home. They were met with an angry father. Where is your sister? The Sea King shouted. Where have you all been? They told the father the trouble the youngest sister was in. The father swam up to the wedding ship. He saw the prince and princess getting ready to marry. He knew that his daughter did not use the knife the night before. At once, The Sea King rushed to see the Sea Witch. She laughed. She said there was only one way to save his youngest daughter from her fate. If he would just hand over his scepter to her, the little mermaid could be saved. With the scepter in her hand, the Sea Witch would rule the underworld kingdom. The Sea King took a deep breath. What else could he do? So, he agreed. The Sea Witch grabbed the scepter and laughed in glee. She rushed to the wedding ship to see her victory. The little mermaid saw the Sea Witch rise out of the sea. She saw that with the scepter, the Sea Witch had become a huge sea monster. Tentacles were twisting out from all over her body like an octopus. The little mermaid knew she must protect the prince and even his new bride. So she took out the knife. Just then, one of the Sea Witch's tentacles reached out and lifted the little mermaid right off the ship. "This is the end for you," crowed the Sea Witch. Before the little mermaid knew it, she was wrapped up by the tentacle. She was spun to the very chest of the Sea Witch. And the knife she was holding, the Sea Witch's very own knife, she used it and dove it deep into the chest of the monster. The Sea Witch reeled back in pain and the little mermaid was freed. On the ship, the guests ran around in fear. The prince shot arrow after arrow at the monster. Finally, the Sea Witch dropped down under the water. As she fell, the little mermaid's voice was let go, and it returned to her. The princess then shouted in a gruff, harsh voice, "What a lousy kingdom this is! You can't even have a proper wedding." The prince heard the princess and knew that she was not who he thought she was. Then the little mermaid started to sing. The prince knew that the voice he remembered belonged to the very one he had grown to love. The angry princess stormed off the wedding ship. And her family followed close behind. When the Sea King arrived, the scepter was floating in the sea, as if it were waiting for him. With a sweep of his arm, it was his again. "Well," said the Sea King, "I see my daughter is in good hands." And, with a wave of his scepter, he lifted the little mermaid back onto the ship. The prince put his arms around her. "Now I know it was you all along," said the prince. "Will you marry me?" The little mermaid had her voice back now. But with all the happiness in her heart, she could not manage to speak. So she nodded, yes, with a warm smile. And a wedding on board ship took place after all. Thanks for listening. Our next story is titled Beauty and the Beast. Once upon a time, in a very far-off country, there lived a merchant who had been so fortunate in all his undertakings that he was enormously rich. As he had, however, 6 sons and 6 daughters, he found that his money was not too much to let them all have everything they fancied, as they were accustomed to do. But one day a most unexpected misfortune befell them. Their house caught fire and was speedily burnt to the ground, with all the splendid furniture, the books, pictures, gold, silver, and precious goods it contained, and this was only the beginning of their troubles. Their father, who had until this moment prospered in all ways, suddenly lost every ship he had upon the sea, either by dint of pirates, shipwreck, or fire. Then he heard that his clerks in distant countries, whom he trusted entirely, had proved unfaithful, and at last from great wealth he fell into the direst poverty. All that he had left was a little house in a desolate place at least 100 leagues from the town in which he had lived, and to this he was forced to retreat with his children, who were in despair at the idea of leading such a different life. Indeed, the daughters at first hoped that their friends, who had been so numerous while they were rich, would insist on their staying in their houses now they no longer possessed one. But they soon found that they were left alone, and that their former friends even attributed their misfortunes to their own extravagance, and showed no intention of offering them any help. So nothing was left for them but to take the departure to the cottage, which stood in the midst of a dark forest, and seemed to be the most dismal place upon the face of the earth. As they were too poor to have any servants, the girls had to work hard, like peasants, and the sons, for their part, cultivated the fields to earn their living. Roughly clothed, and living in the simplest way, the girls regretted unceasingly the luxuries and amusements of their former life. Only the youngest tried to be brave and cheerful. She had been as sad as anyone when misfortune overtook her father, but, soon recovering her natural gaiety, she set to work to make the best of things, to amuse her father and brothers as well as she could, and to try to persuade her sisters to join her in dancing and singing. But they would do nothing of the sort, and, because she was not as doleful as themselves, they declared that this miserable life was all she was fit for. But she was really far prettier and cleverer than they were. Indeed, she was so lovely that she was always called Beauty. After 2 years, when they were all beginning to get used to their new life, something happened to disturb their tranquility. Their father received the news that one of his ships, which he had believed to be lost, had come safely into port with a rich cargo. All the sons and daughters at once thought that their poverty was at an end, and wanted to set out directly for the town, but their father, who was more prudent, begged them to wait a little, and, though it was harvest time, and he could ill be spared, determined to go himself first, to make inquiries. Only the youngest daughter had any doubt but that they would soon again be as rich as they were before, or at least rich enough to live comfortably in some town where they would find amusement and gay companions once more. So they all loaded their father with commissions for jewels and dresses which it would have taken a fortune to buy. Only Beauty, feeling sure that it was of no use, did not ask for anything. Her father, noticing her silence, said, "And what shall I bring for you, Beauty?" "The only thing I wish for is to see you come home safely," she answered. But this only vexed her sisters, who fancied she was blaming them for having asked for such costly things. Her father, however, was pleased, but as he thought that at her age she certainly ought to like pretty presents, he told her to choose something. "Well, dear father," she said, "as you insist upon it, I beg that you will bring me a rose. I have not seen one since we came here, and I love them so much." So the merchant set out and reached the town as quickly as possible, but only to find that his former companions, believing him to be dead, had divided between them the goods which the ship had brought, and after 6 months of trouble and expense he found himself as poor as when he started, having been able to recover only just enough to pay the cost of his journey. To make matters worse, he was obliged to leave the town in the most terrible weather, so that by the time he was within a few leagues of his home he was almost exhausted with cold and fatigue. Though he knew it would take some hours to get through the forest, he was so anxious to be at his journey's end that he resolved to go on. But night overtook him, and the deep snow and bitter frost made it impossible for his horse to carry him any further. Not a house was to be seen. The only shelter he could get was the hollow trunk of a great tree, and there he crouched all the night, which seemed to him the longest he had ever known. In spite of his weariness, the howling of the wolves kept him awake, and even when at last the day broke he was not much better off, for the falling snow had covered up every path, and he did not know which way to turn. At length he made out some sort of track, and though at the beginning it was so rough and slippery that he fell down more than once, it presently became easier, and led him into an avenue of trees which ended in a splendid castle. It seemed to the merchant very strange that no snow had fallen in the avenue, which was entirely composed of orange trees, covered with flowers and fruit. When he reached the first court of the castle he saw before him a flight of agate steps, and went up them, and passed through several splendidly furnished rooms. The pleasant warmth of the air revived him, and he felt very hungry, but there seemed to be nobody in all this vast and splendid palace whom he could ask to give him something to eat. Deep silence reigned everywhere, and at last, tired of roaming through empty rooms and galleries, he stopped in a room smaller than the rest, where a clear fire was burning and a couch was drawn up closely to it. Thinking that this must be prepared for someone who was expected, he sat down to wait till he should come, and very soon fell into a sweet sleep. When his extreme hunger wakened him after several hours, he was still alone, but a little table, upon which was a good dinner, had been drawn up close to him, and, as he had eaten nothing for 24 hours, he lost no time in beginning his meal, hoping that he might soon have an opportunity of thanking his considerate entertainer, whoever it might be. But no one appeared, and even after another long sleep, from which he awoke completely refreshed, there was no sign of anybody, though a fresh meal of dainty cakes and fruit was prepared upon the little table at his elbow. Being naturally timid, The silence began to terrify him, and he resolved to search once more through all the rooms, but it was of no use. Not even a servant was to be seen. There was no sign of life in the palace. He began to wonder what he should do, and to amuse himself by pretending that all the treasures he saw were his own, and considering how he would divide them among his children. Then he went down into the garden, and though it was winter everywhere else, here the sun shone, and the birds sang, and the flowers bloomed, and the air was soft and sweet. The merchant, in ecstasies with all he saw and heard, said to himself, "All this must be meant for me. I will go this minute and bring my children to share all these delights." In spite of being so cold and weary when he reached the castle, he had taken his horse to the stable and fed it. Now he thought he would saddle it for his homeward journey, and he turned down the path which led to the stable. This path had a hedge of roses on each side of it, and the merchant thought he had never seen or smelt such exquisite flowers. They reminded him of his promise to Beauty, and he stopped and had just gathered one to take to her when he was startled by a strange noise behind him. Turning round, he saw a frightful beast, which seemed to be very angry and said, in a terrible voice, "Who told you that you might gather my roses? Was it not enough that I allowed you to be in my palace and was kind to you? This is the way you show your gratitude, by stealing my flowers. But your insolence shall not go unpunished." The merchant, terrified by these furious words, dropped the fatal rose, and, throwing himself on his knees, cried, "Pardon me, noble sir. I am truly grateful to you for your hospitality, which was so magnificent that I could not imagine that you would be offended by my taking such a little thing as a rose." But the beast's anger was not lessened by this speech. "You are very ready with excuses and flattery," he cried, "but that will not save you from the death you deserve." "Alas," thought the merchant, "if my daughter could only know what danger her rose has brought me into." And in despair he began to tell the beast all his misfortunes, and the reason of his journey, not forgetting to mention Beauty's request. "A king's ransom would hardly have procured all that my other daughters asked," he said, "but I thought that I might at least take Beauty her rose. I beg you to forgive me, for you see I meant no harm." The beast considered for a moment, and then he said, in a less furious tone, "I will forgive you on one condition, that is, that you will give me one of your daughters." "Ah," cried the merchant, "if I were cruel enough to buy my own life at the expense of one of my children's, what excuse could I invent to bring her here?" "No excuse would be necessary," answered the beast. "If she comes at all, she must come willingly. On no other condition will I have her. See if any one of them is courageous enough, and loves you well enough to come and save your life. You seem to be an honest man, so I will trust you to go home. I give you a month to see if either of your daughters will come back with you and stay here, to let you go free. If neither of them is willing, you must come alone, after bidding them goodbye forever, for then you will belong to me. And do not imagine that you can hide from me, for if you fail to keep your word I will come and fetch you," added the beast grimly. The merchant accepted this proposal, though he did not really think any of his daughters could be persuaded to come. He promised to return at the time appointed, and then, anxious to escape from the presence of the beast, he asked permission to set off at once. But the beast answered that he could not go until next day. "Then you will find a horse ready for you," he said. "Now go and eat your supper, and await my orders." The poor merchant, more dead than alive, went back to his room, where the most delicious supper was already served on the little table which was drawn up before a blazing fire. But he was too terrified to eat, and only tasted a few of the dishes, for fear the beast should be angry if he did not obey his orders. When he had finished he heard a great noise in the next room, which he knew meant that the beast was coming. As he could do nothing to escape his visit, the only thing that remained was to seem as little afraid as possible. So when the beast appeared and asked roughly if he had supped well, the merchant answered humbly that he had, thanks to his host's kindness. Then the beast warned him to remember their agreement, and to prepare his daughter exactly for what she had to expect. "Do not get up tomorrow," he added, "until you see the sun and hear a golden bell ring. Then you will find your breakfast waiting for you here, and the horse you are to ride will be ready in the courtyard. He will also bring you back again when you come with your daughter a month hence. Farewell. Take a rose to Beauty, and remember your promise. The merchant was only too glad when the beast went away, and though he could not sleep for sadness, he lay down until the sun rose. Then, after a hasty breakfast, he went to gather Beauty's rose, and mounted his horse, which carried him off so swiftly that in an instant he had lost sight of the palace, and he was still wrapped in gloomy thoughts when it stopped before the door of the cottage. His sons and daughters, who had been very uneasy at his long absence, rushed to meet him, eager to know the result of his journey, which, seeing him mounted upon a splendid horse and wrapped in a rich mantle, they supposed to be favorable. He hid the truth from them at first, only saying sadly to Beauty as he gave her the rose, "Here is what you asked me to bring you, you little know what it has cost." But this excited their curiosity so greatly that presently he told them his adventures from beginning to end, and then they were all very unhappy. The girls lamented loudly over their lost hopes, and the sons declared that their father should not return to this terrible castle, and began to make plans for killing the beast if it should come to fetch him. But he reminded them that he had promised to go back. Then the girls were very angry with Beauty, and said it was all her fault, and that if she had asked for something sensible this would never have happened, and complained bitterly that they should have to suffer for her folly. Poor Beauty, much distressed, said to them, "I have, indeed, caused this misfortune, but I assure you I did it innocently. Who could have guessed that to ask for a rose in the middle of summer would cause so much misery? But as I did the mischief it is only just that I should suffer for it. I will therefore go back with my father to keep his promise." At first nobody would hear of this arrangement, and her father and brothers, who loved her dearly, declared that nothing should make them let her go, but Beauty was firm. As the time drew near she divided all her little possessions between her sisters, and said goodbye to everything she loved, and when the fatal day came she encouraged and cheered her father as they mounted together the horse which had brought him back. It seemed to fly rather than gallop, but so smoothly that Beauty was not frightened. Indeed, she would have enjoyed the journey if she had not feared what might happen to her at the end of it. Her father still tried to persuade her to go back, but in vain. While they were talking the night fell, and then, to the great surprise, wonderful colored lights began to shine in all directions, and splendid fireworks blazed out before them. All the forest was illuminated by them, and even felt pleasantly warm, though it had been bitterly cold before. This lasted until they reached the avenue of orange trees, where were statues holding flaming torches, and when they got nearer to the palace they saw that it was illuminated from the roof to the ground, and music sounded softly from the courtyard. "The beast must be very hungry," said Beauty, trying to laugh, "if he makes all this rejoicing over the arrival of his prey." But, in spite of her anxiety, she could not help admiring all the wonderful things she saw. The horse stopped at the foot of the flight of steps leading to the terrace, and when they had dismounted her father led her to the little room he had been in before, where they found a splendid fire burning, and the table daintily spread with a delicious supper. The merchant knew that this was meant for them, and Beauty, who was rather less frightened now that she had passed through so many rooms and seen nothing of the beast, was quite willing to begin, for her long ride had made her very hungry. But they had hardly finished their meal when the noise of the beast's footsteps was heard approaching, and Beauty clung to her father in terror, which became all the greater when she saw how frightened he was. But when the beast really appeared, though she trembled at the sight of him, she made a great effort to hide her terror, and saluted him respectfully. This evidently pleased the beast. After looking at her he said, in a tone that might have struck terror into the boldest heart, though he did not seem to be angry, "Good evening, old man." "Good evening, Beauty." The merchant was too terrified to reply, but Beauty answered sweetly, "Good evening, beast." "Have you come willingly?" asked the beast. "Will you be content to stay here when your father goes away?" Beauty answered bravely that she was quite prepared to stay. "I am pleased with you," said the beast. "As you have come of your own accord, you may stay. As for you, old man," he added, turning to the merchant, "at sunrise tomorrow you will take your departure. When the bell rings get up quickly and eat your breakfast, and you will find the same horse waiting to take you home, but remember that you must never expect to see my palace again." Then turning to Beauty, he said, "Take your father into the next room, and help him to choose everything you think your brothers and sisters would like to have. You will find 2 traveling trunks there. Fill them as full as you can. It is only just that you should send them something very precious as a remembrance of yourself." Then he went away, after saying, "Goodbye, Beauty. Goodbye, old man." And though Beauty was beginning to think with great dismay of her father's departure, she was afraid to disobey the beast's orders, and they went into the next room, which had shelves and cupboards all round it. They were greatly surprised at the riches it contained. There were splendid dresses fit for a queen, with all the ornaments that were to be worn with them, and when Beauty opened the cupboards she was quite dazzled by the gorgeous jewels that lay in heaps upon every shelf. After choosing a vast quantity, which she divided between her sisters, for she had made a heap of the wonderful dresses for each of them, she opened the last chest, which was full of gold. "I think, father," she said, "that, as the gold will be more useful to you, we had better take out the other things again, and fill the trunks with it." So they did this, but the more they put in the more room there seemed to be, and at last they put back all the jewels and dresses they had taken out, and Beauty even added as many more of the jewels as she could carry at once, and then the trunks were not too full, but they were so heavy that an elephant could not have carried them. "The beast was mocking us," cried the merchant. "He must have pretended to give us all these things, knowing that I could not carry them away." "Let us wait and see," answered Beauty. "I cannot believe that he meant to deceive us. All we can do is to fasten them up and leave them ready." So they did this and returned to the little room, where, to their astonishment, they found breakfast ready. The merchant ate his with a good appetite, as the beast's generosity made him believe that he might perhaps venture to come back soon and see Beauty. But she felt sure that her father was leaving her forever, so she was very sad when the bell rang sharply for the second time, and warned them that the time had come for them to part. They went down into the courtyard, where 2 horses were waiting, one loaded with the 2 trunks, the other for him to ride. They were pawing the ground in their impatience to start, and the merchant was forced to bid Beauty a hasty farewell, and as soon as he was mounted he went off at such a pace that she lost sight of him in an instant. Then Beauty began to cry, and wandered sadly back to her own room. But she soon found that she was very sleepy, and as she had nothing better to do she lay down and instantly fell asleep. And then she dreamed that she was walking by a brook bordered with trees, and lamenting her sad fate, when a young prince, handsomer than anyone she had ever seen, and with a voice that went straight to her heart, came and said to her, "Ah, Beauty, you are not so unfortunate as you suppose. Here you will be rewarded for all you have suffered elsewhere. Your every wish shall be gratified. Only try to find me out, no matter how I may be disguised, as I love you dearly, and in making me happy you will find your own happiness. Be as true-hearted as you are beautiful, and we shall have nothing left to wish for." "What can I do, Prince, to make you happy?" said Beauty. "Only be grateful," he answered, "and do not trust too much to your eyes. And, above all, do not desert me until you have saved me from my cruel misery." After this she thought she found herself in a room with a stately and beautiful lady, who said to her, "Dear Beauty, try not to regret all you have left behind you, for you are destined to a better fate. Only do not let yourself be deceived by appearances." Beauty found her dreams so interesting that she was in no hurry to awake, but presently the clock roused her by calling her name softly 12 times, and then she got up and found her dressing table set out with everything she could possibly want, and when her toilet was finished she found dinner was waiting in the room next to hers. But dinner does not take very long when you are all by yourself, and very soon she sat down cozily in the corner of a sofa, and began to think about the charming prince she had seen in her dream. "He said I could make him happy," said Beauty to herself. "It seems, then, that this horrible beast keeps him a prisoner. How can I set him free? I wonder why they both told me not to trust to appearances. I don't understand it. But, after all, it was only a dream, so why should I trouble myself about it? I had better go and find something to do to amuse myself. So she got up and began to explore some of the many rooms of the palace. The first she entered was lined with mirrors, and Beauty saw herself reflected on every side, and thought she had never seen such a charming room. Then a bracelet which was hanging from a chandelier caught her eye, and on taking it down she was greatly surprised to find that it held a portrait of her unknown admirer, just as she had seen him in her dream. With great delight she slipped the bracelet on her arm, and went on into a gallery of pictures, where she soon found a portrait of the same handsome prince, as large as life, and so well painted that as she studied it he seemed to smile kindly at her. Tearing herself away from the portrait at last, she passed through into a room which contained every musical instrument under the sun, and here she amused herself for a long while in trying some of them, and singing until she was tired. The next room was a library, and she saw everything she had ever wanted to read, as well as everything she had read, and it seemed to her that a whole lifetime would not be enough to even read the names of the books, there were so many. By this time it was growing dusk, and wax candles in diamond and ruby candlesticks were beginning to light themselves in every room. Beauty found her supper served just at the time she preferred to have it, but she did not see anyone or hear a sound, and, though her father had warned her that she would be alone, she began to find it rather dull. But presently she heard the beast coming, and wondered tremblingly if he meant to eat her up now. However, as he did not seem at all ferocious, and only said gruffly, "Good evening, Beauty," she answered cheerfully and managed to conceal her terror. Then the beast asked her how she had been amusing herself, and she told him all the rooms she had seen. Then he asked if she thought she could be happy in his palace, and Beauty answered that everything was so beautiful that she would be very hard to please if she could not be happy. And after about an hour's talk Beauty began to think that the beast was not nearly so terrible as she had supposed at first. Then he got up to leave her, and said in his gruff voice, "Do you love me, Beauty? Will you marry me?" "Oh, what shall I say?" cried Beauty, for she was afraid to make the beast angry by refusing. "Say yes, or no, without fear," he replied. "Oh, no, beast," said Beauty hastily. "Since you will not, good night, Beauty," he said. And she answered, "Good night, beast," very glad to find that her refusal had not provoked him. And after he was gone she was very soon in bed and asleep, and dreaming of her unknown prince. She thought he came and said to her, "Ah, Beauty, why are you so unkind to me? I fear I am fated to be unhappy for many a long day still." And then her dreams changed, but the charming prince figured in them all, and when morning came her first thought was to look at the portrait, and see if it was really like him, and she found that it certainly was. This morning she decided to amuse herself in the garden, for the sun shone, and all the fountains were playing, but she was astonished to find that every place was familiar to her, and presently she came to the brook where the myrtle trees were growing where she had first met the prince in her dream, and that made her think more than ever that he must be kept a prisoner by the beast. When she was tired she went back to the palace, and found a new room full of materials for every kind of work, ribbons to make into bows, and silks to work into flowers. Then there was an aviary full of rare birds, which were so tame that they flew to Beauty as soon as they saw her, and perched upon her shoulders and her head. "Pretty little creatures," she said, "how I wish that your cage was nearer to my room, that I might often hear you sing." So saying she opened a door, and found, to her delight, that it led into her own room, though she had thought it was quite the other side of the palace. There were more birds in a room farther on, parrots and cockatoos that could talk, and they greeted Beauty by name. Indeed, she found them so entertaining that she took one or two back to her room, and they talked to her while she was at supper, after which the beast paid her his usual visit, and asked her the same questions as before, and then with a gruff, "Good night," he took his departure, and Beauty went to bed to dream of her mysterious prince. The days passed swiftly in different amusements, and after a while Beauty found out another strange thing in the palace, which often pleased her when she was tired of being alone. There was one room which she had not noticed particularly. It was empty, except that under each of the windows stood a very comfortable chair, and the first time she had looked out of the window it had seemed to her that a black curtain prevented her from seeing anything outside. But the second time she went into the room, happening to be tired, she sat down in one of the chairs, when instantly the curtain was rolled aside, and a most amusing pantomime was acted before her. There were dances, and colored lights, and music, and pretty dresses, and it was all so gay that Beauty was in ecstasies. After that she tried the other 7 windows in turn, and there was some new and surprising entertainment to be seen from each of them, so that Beauty never could feel lonely any more. Every evening after supper the Beast came to see her, and always before saying good night asked her in his terrible voice, "Beauty, will you marry me?" And it seemed to Beauty, now she understood him better, that when she said, "No, Beast," he went away quite sad. But her happy dreams of the handsome young prince soon made her forget the poor Beast, and the only thing that at all disturbed her was to be constantly told to distrust appearances, to let her heart guide her, and not her eyes, and many other equally perplexing things, which, consider as she would, she could not understand. So everything went on for a long time, until at last, happy as she was, Beauty began to long for the sight of her father and her brothers and sisters, and one night, seeing her look very sad, the Beast asked her what was the matter. Beauty had quite ceased to be afraid of him. Now she knew that he was really gentle in spite of his ferocious looks and his dreadful voice. So she answered that she was longing to see her home once more. Upon hearing this the Beast seemed sadly distressed, and cried miserably, "Ah, Beauty, have you the heart to desert an unhappy beast like this? What more do you want to make you happy? Is it because you hate me that you want to escape?" "No, dear Beast," answered Beauty softly, "I do not hate you, and I should be very sorry never to see you any more, but I long to see my father again. Only let me go for 2 months, and I promise to come back to you and stay for the rest of my life." The Beast, who had been sighing dolefully while she spoke, now replied, "I cannot refuse you anything you ask, even though it should cost me my life. Take the 4 boxes you will find in the room next to your own, and fill them with everything you wish to take with you. But remember your promise and come back when the 2 months are over, or you may have cause to repent it, for if you do not come in good time you will find your faithful Beast dead. You will not need any chariot to bring you back. Only say goodbye to all your brothers and sisters the night before you come away, and when you have gone to bed turn this ring round upon your finger and say firmly, 'I wish to go back to my palace and see my Beast again.' Good night, Beauty. Fear nothing, sleep peacefully, and before long you shall see your father once more." As soon as Beauty was alone she hastened to fill the boxes with all the rare and precious things she saw about her, and only when she was tired of heaping things into them did they seem to be full. Then she went to bed, but could hardly sleep for joy. And when at last she did begin to dream of her beloved prince she was grieved to see him stretched upon a grassy bank, sad and weary, and hardly like himself. "What is the matter?" she cried. He looked at her reproachfully, and said, "How can you ask me, cruel one? Are you not leaving me to my death perhaps?" "Ah, don't be so sorrowful," cried Beauty. "I am only going to assure my father that I am safe and happy. I have promised the Beast faithfully that I will come back, and he would die of grief if I did not keep my word." "What would that matter to you?" said the prince, "surely you would not care." "Indeed, I should be ungrateful if I did not care for such a kind beast," cried Beauty indignantly. "I would die to save him from pain. I assure you it is not his fault that he is so ugly." Just then a strange sound woke her. Someone was speaking not very far away, and opening her eyes she found herself in a room she had never seen before, which was certainly not nearly so splendid as those she was used to in the Beast's palace. Where could she be? She got up and dressed hastily, and then saw that the boxes she had packed the night before were all in the room. While she was wondering by what magic the Beast had transported them and herself to this strange place she suddenly heard her father's voice, and rushed out and greeted him joyfully. Her brothers and sisters were all astonished at her appearance, as they had never expected to see her again, and there was no end to the questions they asked her. She had also much to hear about what had happened to them while she was away, and of her father's journey home. But when they heard that she had only come to be with them for a short time, and then must go back to the beast's palace forever, they lamented loudly. Then Beauty asked her father what he thought could be the meaning of her strange dreams, and why the prince constantly begged her not to trust to appearances. After much consideration, he answered, "You tell me yourself that the beast, frightful as he is, loves you dearly, and deserves your love and gratitude for his gentleness and kindness. I think the prince must mean you to understand that you ought to reward him by doing as he wishes you to, in spite of his ugliness." Beauty could not help seeing that this seemed very probable. Still, when she thought of her dear prince who was so handsome, she did not feel at all inclined to marry the beast. At any rate, for 2 months she need not decide, but could enjoy herself with her sisters. But though they were rich now, and lived in town again, and had plenty of acquaintances, Beauty found that nothing amused her very much, and she often thought of the palace, where she was so happy, especially as at home she never once dreamed of her dear prince, and she felt quite sad without him. Then her sisters seemed to have got quite used to being without her, and even found her rather in the way, so she would not have been sorry when the 2 months were over but for her father and brothers, who begged her to stay, and seemed so grieved at the thought of her departure that she had not the courage to say good-bye to them. Every day when she got up she meant to say it at night, and when night came she put it off again, until at last she had a dismal dream which helped her to make up her mind. She thought she was wandering in a lonely path in the palace gardens, when she heard groans which seemed to come from some bushes hiding the entrance of a cave, and running quickly to see what could be the matter, she found the beast stretched out upon his side, apparently dying. He reproached her faintly with being the cause of his distress, and at the same moment a stately lady appeared, and said very gravely, "Ah, Beauty, you are only just in time to save his life. See what happens when people do not keep their promises. If you had delayed 1 day more, you would have found him dead." Beauty was so terrified by this dream that the next morning she announced her intention of going back at once, and that very night she said goodbye to her father and all her brothers and sisters, and as soon as she was in bed she turned her ring round upon her finger, and said firmly, "I wish to go back to my palace and see my beast again," as she had been told to do. Then she fell asleep instantly, and only woke up to hear the clock saying, "Beauty, Beauty," 12 times in its musical voice, which told her at once that she was really in the palace once more. Everything was just as before, and her birds were so glad to see her. But Beauty thought she had never known such a long day, for she was so anxious to see the beast again that she felt as if supper-time would never come. But when it did come and no beast appeared she was really frightened, so, after listening and waiting for a long time, she ran down into the garden to search for him. Up and down the paths and avenues ran poor Beauty, calling him in vain, for no one answered, and not a trace of him could she find, until at last, quite tired, she stopped for a minute's rest, and saw that she was standing opposite the shady path she had seen in her dream. She rushed down it, and, sure enough, there was the cave, and in it lay the beast, asleep, as Beauty thought. Quite glad to have found him, she ran up and stroked his head, but, to her horror, he did not move or open his eyes. "Oh, he is dead, and it is all my fault," said Beauty, crying bitterly. But then, looking at him again, she fancied he still breathed, and, hastily fetching some water from the nearest fountain, she sprinkled it over his face, and, to her great delight, he began to revive. "Oh, beast, how you frightened me," she cried. "I never knew how much I loved you until just now, when I feared I was too late to save your life." "Can you really love such an ugly creature as I am?" said the beast faintly. "Ah, Beauty, you only came just in time. I was dying because I thought you had forgotten your promise. But go back now and rest, I shall see you again by and by." Beauty, who had half expected that he would be angry with her, was reassured by his gentle voice, and went back to the palace, where supper was awaiting her, and afterward the beast came in as usual, and talked about the time she had spent with her father, asking if she had enjoyed herself, and if they had all been very glad to see her. Beauty answered politely, and quite enjoyed telling him all that had happened to her. And when at last the time came for him to go, and he asked, as he had so often asked before, Beauty, will you marry me? She answered softly, Yes, dear beast. As she spoke, a blaze of light sprang up before the windows of the palace. Fireworks crackled and guns banged, and across the avenue of orange trees, in letters all made of fireflies, was written, Long live the prince and his bride. Turning to ask the beast what it could all mean, Beauty found that he had disappeared, and in his place stood her long-loved prince. At the same moment the wheels of a chariot were heard upon the terrace, and two ladies entered the room. One of them Beauty recognized as the stately lady she had seen in her dreams. The other was also so grand and queenly that Beauty hardly knew which to greet first. But the one she already knew said to her companion, Well, Queen, this is Beauty, who has had the courage to rescue your son from the terrible enchantment. They love one another, and only your consent to their marriage is wanting to make them perfectly happy. I consent with all my heart, cried the Queen. How can I ever thank you enough, charming girl, for having restored my dear son to his natural form? And then she tenderly embraced Beauty and the prince, who had meanwhile been greeting the fairy and receiving her congratulations. Now, said the fairy to Beauty, I suppose you would like me to send for all your brothers and sisters to dance at your wedding. And so she did, and the marriage was celebrated the very next day with the utmost splendor, and Beauty and the prince lived happily ever after. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to hit the notification bell. Bye for now. And get ready for the next story.